Hi, everyone. Uh, the purpose of this lecture and the one that will follow it is to delve into the architecture of apartheid, to really kind of break down the policies of this system, um, and to talk to some extent about the strategy that the National Party government followed to make this palatable not only to the whole of the white population in South Africa, but also to the international community. And after that, we'll deal with African responses to this, with resistance and things like that. But we need to understand the system itself in order to comprehend why this is such an infernal and oppressive thing, and why South Africa was able to perpetuate this and to justify it for so long. So the architects of apartheid, especially Hendrik Verwoerd, uh, created a South Africa that was divided between, as they called it, four different races. Okay, the whites, the blacks, the coloreds, and the Asians, mostly Indian population, as we've said, right? But it actually became a good deal more complex than that. Okay, because even at the beginning of apartheid in late 1940s, early 1950s, the white population only constituted in total about 20% of the whole population of South Africa, somewhere between 15 and 20%. Um, the Bantus, that is the black Africans, made up somewhere around 70% of the entire population, maybe a little bit more than 70%. So, if you're now, the South African government represented itself as a democracy, claimed to be a democracy. Now, how can you possibly say that you're a democracy if only 20% of the population has any say in the government, right? Has any voting rights or anything like that? Well, you do this with some tricky rhetoric, right? Now, we've already examined the fact that one of the great historic rivalries in South Africa was between the Afrikaners and the British, and so if there was to be a political division, you might imagine that it would, that the Afrikaners would segregate themselves off from the British, but that's not what happened at all. They claimed that all whites were, part of one ethnic group or one race. That the coloreds were a separate people, a separate ethnic group or race, and the Indians were a separate ethnic group or race. And then to make that 70% figure go away, and to at least come up with some justification to say they were functioning democratically, or rather that the majority was ruling, they divided the blacks up into 11 ethnic groups, and they said that each one of these ethnic groups was independent of every other one, right? That they were not a united bloc, unlike the whites, of course, who, if anything, had greater long-standing rivalries between each other than any of the black groups did with each other, with the possible exception of the Zulu. But these were all separate peoples. And, if they were divided up that way, no single black nation, as they were called under the apartheid system, had more than something like 10 to 15% of the total population of the country. Thus, whites were able to say that the largest ethnic group, the largest division in South African society was the white one. Now, that is actually going to change, and the white population, after reaching a height of about 20% of the total population, I think around 1960, began to decline relative to the rest of the population thereafter. By the late 1970s, it was down less than 15%, and I think that the white population of South Africa in recent decades has dipped below 10% of the total population, right? So they were able to say, well, the whites, should be in control because they are the largest of all of these ethnic groups. Now, is that a justifiable thing? Well, I mean, hopefully you can see the problems with it. Um, there was a lot of legislation put into place with the goal of creating the apartheid system. And, we could spend an exhaustive amount of time looking at every piece of legislation, trying to comprehend it, looking at examples of the effects that it had. I'm just going to hit a few of these. I think a few of the most important. The legislation really came fast and furious in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, as there were more and more challenges to the apartheid system. Parliamentary legislation was one of the chief ways that the whites had of making that opposition go away. So one of the ways to divide the society was to make it illegal for people to cross the race barriers in marriage or even in sexual relations. So there was a Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949. This was followed by something called the Immorality Act, which forbade or made illegal any sort of sexual relation between people of different races. Um, in 1950, the South African Parliament passed something called the Population Registration Act, which really created the identity of these nations, these 11 African nations. People had to register with the government and state that they were a Zulu or a Xhosa or a Tswana or something like that. And so they put these people into these categories, and there are going to be extensions of this, as we'll talk about. Now, that's one of the chief ways they had of dividing people up, but this went hand in hand. Sorry, I'm struggling with allergies today. Anyway, this went hand in hand with the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and eventually the Immorality Act, because as people registered and identified themselves as belonging to one ethnic group or another, the government often stepped in and actually broke up families. Say a white person was married to a colored person or something like that, the government threatened them with jail and other repercussions if they did not annul or dissolve the marriage. And so the South African government was very, very intrusive into family life in this respect. The body that had represented the Africans all through the segregation era, this was not a directly elected thing. This was chosen in a non-electoral fashion, appointed, but it was abolished in 1951, and there was really never any political body from then on that represented African interests. And increasingly, all of the would-be representative groups were made illegal. The political parties, the trade unions, and other things, all of these things were deemed illegal under South African law, and the natives really had no recourse to political representation of any kind. The colored people continued to enjoy the franchise in the Cape, but in the 1950s, this was done away with, and this was actually a fairly long saga. The Parliament decreed or made laws that stripped the colored franchise. The courts challenged that. The Parliament responded to override what the courts said, and eventually even passed a law with a full, more than 2/3 majority, which stated that the courts could not have any oversight of parliamentary decisions on who had the franchise or not. Right, so they effectively did away with the judicial branch overview or oversight of any of the parliamentary laws. Now, one of the bedrock components of the apartheid system, if I had to identify the most fundamental, foundational parts of it, this is one of the very most important, maybe the most important. And this is an extension of things we've already talked about, right? So going back into the 19th century, the British government had created these things called African locations, near the key mining cities and other places where blacks were going to get jobs. Under segregation, they had created the reserves, as they were called. Well, under the apartheid system, Verwoerd and others began to call them the homelands. And they did this with the notion certainly a completely erroneous notion, that these were the traditional lands that the African peoples had controlled, as of and they kind of made up dates, as of the 17th century when Europeans got there, or 18th century when, anyway, they invented sort of historical, or I should say, made up uh, kind of historical concepts to justify this. Okay. Um, but each major black nation, the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Venda, the Pedi, the Sotho, the Tswana, and so forth, all had a homeland. Okay. And this, under the apartheid system, was to be the only place that those people could live legally. Anyone who identified via the stipulations of the Population Registration Act as a Xhosa had to live in one of the Xhosa homelands. That was the only legitimate home they had. Actually, the Xhosa had two of them: the Transkei down here and the Ciskei. Okay. If they were Tswana, they had to live in Boputa, Tswana. If they were Pedi, they had to live in Labua. If they were Swaziland, they had to live in Kangwane. If they were Zulu, they had to live in KwaZulu, and so forth and so on. Okay, Sotho, they had to live in Kwakwa, right here. Right. Even if a person had never been to that place, that was now considered their homeland and the only place they could legally reside in. All right. And the government then made serious efforts to try to force people to migrate to those places. Again, even if they had been born and raised in a city or in some other place that was not part of the homeland, they were told that, and even if they owned land, even if they had a historical claim or a title to some piece of land, they were told that that was no longer legitimate, that the only place they could live was their homeland. Now, this was all done, and we read last week in the Williams book, the document by Hendrik Verwoerd, where he talks about apartheid. And he, talks about how the South African government needs to put into place these homelands and needs to offer tutelage to the black people because they are at a much lower state of development, and so the whites need to train them to, to rule themselves, to best take advantage of the resources of the land, to essentially become independent. And the idea in Verwoerd's writing, at least, is this is going to take a really long time because Africans are just primitive, backward, savage peoples, right? I mean, we're still perpetuating the stereotypes of Africans, and so this white tutelage needs to be probably fairly lengthy, but this has to happen because black people cannot live in South Africa. This is not the place for them. South Africa needs to be reserved for white people, right? And we will do our, according to Verwoerd, we will do our best to help these people along, to become independent, to grow their economy, to live and prosper. But if we combine the races, then there's going to be civilizational clash, and it's going to end in violence and chaos, and the destruction of the white people is going to be the inevitable result of this. And so we've got to do this, right? This is the only path forward. And so the homelands were the foundational part of that whole system that Verwoerd was imagining. Okay. Now, who was to have authority in the homelands? Well, of course, it has to be the chiefs, because primitive, savage Africans are ruled by chiefs. Well, never mind that none of these people had chiefs, so to speak, who had anything like regional authority, perhaps outside of the Zulu, who did have a king, but the king was not always the one sort of co-opted into this system. And so they began to create these things. Now there are some other aspects of the homelands that we should notice here, right? Uh, First of all, and this is the last bullet point on the slide here. This is Bophuthatswana. It's there and there and there and there and there and there, and actually this little piece of land down here is also part of Bophuthatswana. Okay, all of this piece of land, 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 these things down here, these are all KwaZulu. Okay, Labua has, well, it's got two parts to it. Gazankulu has some separate ones. Venda is mostly a contiguous place. Transkei and Ciskei were mostly unified territories, but especially Bophuthatswana, right? What about all this other land, like between these parts of it? Well, predictably, that was land that was claimed by whites, and it also happened to be the land that was the most productive, the best farmland, right? As time went on, and these homelands, were embraced by the white government as the place where Africans needed to live, and they, went to great lengths to try to force people into the homelands. The populations in these places just ballooned, and they were living already on marginal land. And as people went there, with, no home, no commitment to the place, and with limited resources there, the land very quickly was used up. The nutrients were stripped from the soils. Soil erosion was absolutely dreadful, and the conditions in these places was just monstrous. There was no infrastructure at all, nothing like sanitation or fresh water systems, other than a few wells that people had often to walk very long distances to get to. The pollution, the lack of sewage disposal, and all of these things were just horrific, right? So the conditions on the homelands became worse and worse over time, and we'll talk more about that. The infant mortality rate in the 1960s and 70s in these homelands was the second highest, I believe, in the world. Something like 100 children out of every 1,000 born onto these homelands did not live to see his or her first birthday. Okay, I think in the United States the infant mortality rate is somewhere around 20, maybe a little bit less than that, somewhere between 10 and 20. In South Africa, 1 out of every 10 children did not live to the age of a year old, because the conditions were just so horrible there, right? Now, the South African government went ahead with this, and in 1971 even, they passed what was called the Bantu Homelands Constitution Act, which stated that the South African government alone could determine when these homelands were ready to become independent and self-governing. Actually, self-governing preceded independence. And they even began to decree some of them as independent nations. 1976, the Transkei was granted independence. 1977, Bophuthatswana, and the Ciskei and Venda followed. The others, I don't think, ever reached full independence. But this independence was an absolute sham, because they didn't have, again, infrastructure. They didn't have airports. They didn't have port structures. They had no way of communicating with the outside world. Now, all of this was done to make this palatable, as the South African government saw it, to the international community. They declared that this was all part of South Africa's effort to decolonize and to join with this general trend in Africa that black people were becoming independent and self-governing, right? That these black African nations were taking the reins of their own countries, and they were becoming independent, and they were functioning on their own, right? So South Africa said, we are the champions of black nationhood and black independence. Well, I mean, nothing could be further from the truth, given what was really happening in these places. But the apartheid government took great pains not to allow anyone to really see what was going on in these homelands. Their control of the press, their control of any news that leaked out, was pretty substantial. Moreover, this system of forcing people onto these homelands insulated white South Africans from even understanding the plight of black people. In the minds of whites, blacks were, they had their own countries. Why do they want to live in South Africa? Why do they want to come here? They've got their own countries, their own self-governance, their own opportunities there. Why do they want to come in and infringe on our territory, right? And they really had little idea, many of them, maybe the vast majority of all white South Africans, had little idea of what was really going on in the homelands, or how the system was really set up. The leaders, by the way, who were co-opted by the South African government were often just terribly corrupt, and capricious, and they had a great deal of wealth. They appropriated a lot of it for themselves. Any taxation money they collected, they tended to pocket this, and so the corruption was rampant, even in conditions of abject poverty. So, because black Africans belonged in the homelands, those who sought jobs or temporary residence in South Africa, temporary residence was the operative term, did not belong there and had no political rights. If they wanted political rights, if they wanted their human rights to be acknowledged, they needed to go to their own country, their own homeland. Right? Never mind, that homeland was not, in truth, independent in any respect, other than rhetorically. But that's the only place where they could be given, recourse to law, where their civil rights would be acknowledged. All black Africans were considered temporary residents in South Africa unless they were in a homeland. And so they had to continue to abide by past laws. They had to carry identification with them. These past laws marked them out as belonging not just to the black race, but to a particular ethnic group, and efforts were made to try to keep different African peoples apart from each other in South Africa, so that they would not come to agreement with each other. They would not collude with each other, and gain any notion of a black nationhood or a black peoplehood. Well, of course, that failed miserably, because as people crowded into these urban spaces, they worked together. They got along. Zulu and Xhosa and Sotho and Tswana and Venda and Pedi all came together, lived together, intermarried with each other, and these ethnic divisions were really of little consequence to them. But according to the South African government, they were trying to keep these people apart because they needed to develop independently of each other. Right? The elimination of black spots, and that term is in quotes there because this was an official nomenclature of the South African government. These are places where black people had historical claims, where they owned land, where they lived in communities. The South African government made great attempts, invested a lot of money in eliminating these. Many of them were in rural settings. Farming communities where black Africans owned their own land, and in some cases had been on that land for a century or more. They were told, this land does not belong to you, this is part of South Africa, you belong in the Transkei, or you belong in KwaZulu, right? And so they stripped them of their claims to land, their ownership of land. This also happened in cities, as residences, which in some cases, neighborhoods that had been in place and inhabited by mostly black people for decades were torn apart, and the people were moved, many of them deported to the homelands or moved to some other place that had been zoned for black occupation. In South Africa, the vast majority of Africans, and I should say, between the 1950s and early 1980s, somewhere along the lines of 3.5 million black people were forcibly removed from one area of South Africa or another. And again, either put back or sent to the homelands or sent to some other part of South Africa that had been zoned for temporary black habitation. The vast majority of black Africans who lived in South Africa lived in cities. I shouldn't say the vast majority. There were a lot in the countryside. Still a lot of black farmers. But over time, there was the trend was that blacks were moving into the cities. And because they could not live legally in the cities themselves, the government in some cases created these things called locations, or townships as they came to be called. In some cases there were squatter camps, and the blacks there would simply put up very temporary structures with whatever building materials they could find, usually corrugated iron and wood, in some cases just kind of like wattle and daub. But these townships became a key feature of the landscape of South Africa, especially the urban landscape. Okay. And the South African government was just in distress about their inability to stop this from happening, and so they tried a number of things to make it more palatable to the white population. For one, they identified townships that were in proximity to the homelands, and they simply made them part of the homelands. Okay, a couple of examples of this. We go back to this map. Part of Bophuthatswana was very close to Pretoria, just north of Pretoria and just west of Pretoria over here. And there were huge numbers of people crowded into these areas. Most of them would work in Pretoria and its environs, and so they simply made those part of Bophuthatswana. So the townships of Mabopane and Garankuwa, which are right here. I know this because I actually worked in Mabopane for a while. They were not initially part of Bophuthatswana, but just acknowledging that this massive spot of black habitation was not going to go away, they turned it into part of the homeland. Right? Same thing down here in Ciskei. There's a large township called Mdantsane down here, very close to East London. Most of the residents of Mdantsane end up commuting to East London for work, and so they sort of incorporated that into the Ciskei, right? But in places, especially where the township was close to the city center, they zoned these for white residents and forcibly removed the blacks from those territories. The most celebrated case of this, actually there are two, in Cape Town in the mid-1950s. There was a place called District 6, which historically, for many decades, had been the main residence of the colored population there. And in the Cape, the coloreds were quite significant in number. Well, that was zoned for white habitation, and so they tore apart all of the homes in District 6 and forced the coloreds, actually removed them forcibly by buses to a place that was much further away from the city center, which meant that henceforth the coloreds would have to commute much longer distances and be reliant on buses provided by the South African government. The other celebrated one was Sophiatown. This was just west of Johannesburg, and from the beginning of the 20th century had been a major place of black settlement. And it was mostly a shanty town, yes, but blacks were accustomed to living there, and there are multiple generations living there. One of the documents in the Williams book deals with this. This is Part 4, Section B, Document 7. This is a really interesting document. I encourage you to take some time to look at it closely. This is written by an Anglican clergyman, Anglican priest named Trevor Huddleston, who had actually been a clergyman in Sophiatown, had a church there. And even though he's English and white, his perspective on this is really very interesting, and he's sort of calling out the government, for its hypocrisy in its rhetoric and all of that, right? So he says, just to read a couple of excerpts of this briefly, on page 279, about 10 lines down from the top. Freehold rights, even if amenities were lacking, were worth having. He's talking about Sophiatown being a place of great poverty where people lived in shacks, but it was still worth having, right? That was undoubtedly one of the great attractions of Sophiatown, that the people, own their own land, they own their own houses. The other was its nearness to the city. Instead of spending time and money on transport, those who lived way out at Pimville location had to do, they were within cycling distance of their work, right? So they didn't have to rely on public transportation. He says, well, the mines and the industries of South Africa obviously need black labor. They say they need black labor. Labor is labor. It is not human if it is black. It must be there, standing ready in your factory or your kitchen or your office. But it must make no demands for the necessities of life, a roof tree or an income large enough to support the home. It must have strong muscles for the job, but how they are to become strong is its own concern. It must have clean clothes and a tidy appearance in your home, but it doesn't matter where or how it is they get the water for washing or the space for drying. So Johannesburg built its factories, its flats, and its fun fairs. It forgot to build houses for its African citizens, and that's why Sophiatown existed, he says. But now they're saying they can't live here because this is white-only zone, right? At the very end, he kind of sums all of this up. This is page 282. Let's see. The thing which underlies every event of any racial significance in South Africa is the assumption that white civilization is threatened by the very existence of an African community in any way similar to itself. What he's saying here is, what should have been obvious, I think, and that is the blacks are not a different people. They have come into the modern world just like the whites have, but the whites insist that they are different, fundamentally different, that the two cannot coexist in the same space with each other. And to go back and quote the rest of this, the African in the kraal, that is the rural homestead, is in his right place. So is the African in the kitchen, meaning in servitude or slavery. But the African in a European suburb, in a European house, which he himself owns and is proud of, he is a menace. He must be removed. Right? I think Huddleston really gets this right. He is identifying again the rhetoric and the hypocrisy of all of this. The Group Areas Act of 1950 is what, in terms of legislation, made this necessary. It, as I said, zoned different parts of the urban areas for temporary black residents. And some of these places just ballooned in population. I mentioned Soweto in an earlier class. This is actually a picture of Soweto circa 1970s, something like that. This, by the way, is only one small neighborhood of Soweto. Soweto came to have a population by the late 1970s in excess of 1 million people. By the end of apartheid, it may have been 2 or 3 or more million people. A lot of the areas in Soweto, and that was only one of the many townships around South Africa. It was the largest, or I should say around Johannesburg, it was the largest, but it was only one of many. The one on the bottom here, I believe, is Freedom Square. This is close to Bloemfontein. This is a place I actually worked in for a while. It's part of the larger township called Mangaung, right? And so you can see the abject poverty that many of these people lived in these shanty towns. These are more permanent residences. These are 4-bedroom dwellings, and they're pretty common. The government did build some of this housing, but as of the 1970s, the early 1970s, they stopped doing that. By that time, by the late 1970s, it was something like an average of 15 people per house, demographically speaking, in these townships. So, with a growing black urban population, also with a stagnation of black wages, these were frozen in place. And the real wages of black Africans in the early 1970s was actually less than it had been 60 years before in real terms, if corrected for inflation. They did rise somewhat after that, partly through trade union activities by blacks, which was still deemed illegal, but it was effective nevertheless. But even at the best times, even after some progress, the average white person working the same job or something similar to a black African would earn at least 5 times as much, right? Um, and then unemployment was just rampant. In the 1980s, the available statistics show that about a quarter of all of the black African population was unemployed, and that includes large numbers of people, not only in the homelands but in the townships. Um, so these policies are obviously incredibly oppressive, and really do not acknowledge, again, borrowing the words from Huddleston here, the needs at all of the Africans. So we'll talk more about the policies next time, get into some of the other details of this.